decision-making phase. This is perhaps one of the most crucial skills of all of success in America. The ability to make decisions is one of the most important requirements for advancement at any job in any organization. Interestingly enough, it's not necessarily the quality of the decisions that count, but the willingness to reach conclusions and make those decisions in the first place. In one study, 2 groups of managers were tested for their decision-making ability. One of the groups was on the fast track. They were enjoying rapid promotion and regular increases in pay. They were seen to be very decisive and were always willing to accept responsibility for results. The second group was made up of managers who had been passed over for promotion because they seemed to be unable to make decisions in their areas of responsibility. They tested both groups of managers in a classroom setting for the accuracy of their decision-making. They gave them a series of simulated problem situations and tested them on what decisions they would make. Interestingly enough, both the effective and ineffective managers turned out to be equally accurate in their answers to the questions on this classroom test. In other words, their decision-making abilities were the same. The difference between the groups was simply that at work, the effective managers were willing to take the risk of making the decisions, whereas the ineffective managers, equally accurate in their choices, avoided decision-making for fear of making a mistake. Now, here are some important ideas that will help you to make more right decisions in your life and in your career. The first questions that you have to ask in decision-making are these 3. First, what are you trying to achieve with the decision? Second, what are you trying to avoid? Third, what are you trying to preserve? Every decision is aimed at achieving, avoiding, or preserving something. These are called decision criteria or boundary conditions. The very best decision makers are those who clearly identify these criteria and make them measurable before they move to the final decision-making phase. Another question is, what must you accomplish with this decision? What is the very minimum that this decision must achieve? How would you measure the success of this decision? If you were to come back to it later and look at the results of the decision, if the decision had been perfect, what would have happened? For example, if you're going to make a decision to spend a certain amount of money, you would have to ask, what am I trying to achieve, avoid, or preserve? If the money were to be spent on advertising, you would write down exactly what kind of measurable results you would achieve if the advertising money was well spent. If you're thinking of accepting a new job, getting into a serious relationship, or starting your own business, it's very important for you to sit down and write out what you would expect to gain as a result of making this decision correctly. These decision criteria or boundary conditions then become the template against which you measure the suitability of each of the solutions that you've developed in the previous phase of problem solving. Before we continue with this, however, here are some blocking assumptions that often get in the way of effective decision making. A blocking assumption is an assumption that may or may not be true. The first blocking assumption is, does this decision have to be made at all? In other words, is it possible to avoid making this decision? Often, delaying a decision makes the decision unnecessary. A very wise idea is to put off decision-making whenever you possibly can if it's not necessary to decide at this time. Another blocking assumption is that the decision has to be made by you. Is it possible that someone else could make this decision? Would it be better for someone else to make this decision? For example, in my business, as the president of my company, I'm often approached by different people offering different products, services, and ideas. Some years ago, I felt that it was my prerogative to make any decision that came across my desk. Over time, however, I found that if I had hired people with expertise in these areas, these decisions no longer had to be made by me. Now, unless it's a decision that only I can make, I always refer the responsibility for the decision to someone else. This greatly simplifies my life, just as it would simplify your life if you tried it. Whenever you can delegate decision-making to someone else, you should do it. Another question you need to ask, another blocking assumption is, can you afford to make this decision? Can you afford the negative consequences of making this decision incorrectly? If you cannot afford the negative consequences of a bad decision or a decision that doesn't work out, then you should avoid making the decision altogether. If the possible negative ramifications of the decision are such that it could dramatically harm your company, your career, your financial status, or your family, you should put the decision off. On the other hand, there are some decisions that you cannot afford not to make. There are some decisions, sometimes in the form of opportunities, that when they come along, you cannot afford to sit on the fence about them. You have to step up to the plate and make a decision, one way or the other. So ask yourself, is this a decision that we cannot afford not to make? Often in business, you may have to make a decision concerning ethics or government regulations. This is the kind of decision that you cannot afford to leave hanging. You have to step up, accept responsibility, and pass judgment. And finally, can this decision be delayed or deferred? One of the very best recommendations for decision-making of any kind is to sleep on it. Many decisions that seem obvious late in the afternoon seem totally different by the light of dawn the next day. Whenever you can buy time on an important decision, even an entire weekend, be sure to do it. Remember, it's not necessary to decide immediately. The more time that you can take to reflect on a decision, the more likely it is that you're going to make the correct decision when you finally do decide. One of the best time savers and money makers in your entire life is to make the right decision in the first place so that you don't have to spend the time and effort in going back to correct the wrong decision later. Write out a list of your boundary conditions and the things that this decision must accomplish if it's to be a correct and effective decision. Then, compare the solutions that you developed earlier against these boundary conditions and requirements. Which of these solutions seems most ideal when compared against the objective decision-making criteria that you've developed? This method takes a little bit longer and requires a good deal of discipline, but it avoids the tendency that most people have to rush to a judgment, to jump to conclusions with too little information or evidence. Whenever you force yourself to slow down the decision-making process, you increase your ability to remain unemotional and objective. This then increases the quality of your decision-making when you reach the end of the process. Once you've chosen the best decision, the decision that best satisfies all the conditions that you've identified, then you go on to choose the second best decision.